Talking about one more big cultural movement in the North, and this is probably the most important one for U.S. history, and this is abolitionism. Here are your goals. This should guide you through the video as you watch. Alright, so let's begin by talking about the state of African Americans in the 1800s. So by 1860, which is the year that the Civil War began, there were 4.4 million African Americans living in the United States. Most of these people, nearly 4 million of them, lived as slaves in the South. And most of them performed hard labor in agricultural jobs, and many suffered cruel abuse at the hands of white owners. They had no political rights and basically no way to stand up for themselves. Their best chance was probably to escape to the North. Also, in the South, there were about 230,000 free black people. And these guys lived a dangerous existence. They had basically no political rights. They couldn't vote. They probably didn't get very much protection from the law. And they were always at risk of being kidnapped and sold into slavery. And finally, in the North, there were also 250,000 free black people. Some of these guys owned businesses or became skilled craftsmen, but most worked low-paying jobs as manual laborers or servants. They had few political rights, most could not vote, and they were frequently discriminated against by the white majority. And so by the middle of the 1800s, some people, mostly in the North, stood up to address this injustice. So the movement to end slavery in the United States was called abolitionism. These people were for the abolition, that is, the ending of slavery. And so there were two basic types of abolitionism in the United States. There was colonial abolitionism, which wanted to free the slaves and send them back to live in Africa, in a colony that the United States would set up. And then there was radical abolitionism. And these guys wanted to free the slaves and integrate the free African Americans into U.S. society. And there were basically two causes for the abolition movement. One was that other countries were slowly starting to get rid of slavery. Britain got rid of slavery in 1830, and basically they were starting to look at the United States as if they were this kind of backwards, barbaric place because they still relied on this clearly cruel and inhuman practice. Another cause was the Second Great Awakening, which was an increase in religious feelings. Basically, religion gets really big and kind of sweeps through the North. And this leads many there to view all men, regardless of race, as equal before God. And so a lot of people, because of these new religious feelings, start to have new feelings about race and start to have new ideas about whether slavery is right or not. And that there on the right was an important image from the abolitionist cause that shows an African-American man in chains pleading for his freedom, saying, "Am I not a man and a brother?" Basically, am I not also human? Do I not also deserve freedom? Abolitionism first. And this is a pretty weird movement from modern perspectives, but it, for a while, was the most popular kind of abolitionism in the United States. And so lots of white Americans thought that African Americans would be unable to fit into American society. So what they thought would be the best for everybody would be to free the slaves from the South and to send them back to Africa where they could set up their own society. This, of course, ignored the fact that most African Americans had lived in the United States for their entire lives, and that they were a part of a unique American culture. So basically, the enslaved people in the American South were no longer just African. They had formed their own unique culture that was now way different from anything that existed in Africa. So sending them back to Africa didn't really make very much sense. But these people didn't really see it that way. But anyway, this idea remains unpopular among most black abolitionists because they understand that African Americans are now their own unique country, their own unique culture, and not just the same as the people who still live in Africa. But so anyway, in spite of these problems, the American Colonization Society purchases land in Africa, and they name it Liberia, basically meaning like the land of the free. And they begin buying slaves from the South and shipping them to Liberia to live there as free people. And by 1867, this society had shipped almost 13,000 freed African Americans to Liberia. And other freed slaves were also brought there by other means as well. And so Liberia actually became an independent nation in 1847 and continued to receive freed slaves from other regions until much later. Abolitionism kind of dies out and fades away, and a new kind of abolitionism called radical abolitionism becomes much more important and popular. And basically this one calls for total emancipation of slaves and granting of political rights to free African Americans. So basically it says that slaves should be freed and they should become Americans. They should be treated as equals. And this idea begins to catch on and becomes really important just before the Civil War. And there were some important leaders of this movement that you guys should know about. One was William Lloyd Garrison. He was kind of the spokesman for the movement, and he managed to become the spokesman by setting up an anti-slavery newspaper in Boston known as The Liberator. So he wanted to liberate the slaves in the United States. Another very important leader for radical abolitionism was Frederick Douglass, and he was perhaps the most charismatic leader of the entire movement. People would follow him, people were drawn to him. Frederick Douglass started out life as a slave in the South, but he escaped and became an important speaker in the North. One thing that made him so influential was that he published an autobiography that described his life as a slave and showed to Northerners the evils of the institution of slavery. And Frederick Douglass also made the interesting argument that slavery was bad for everybody, not just for African Americans. He has a famous quote down there, which you can see down there at the bottom right, that says, No man can put a chain around the ankle of his fellow man without last finding the other end fastened around his own neck." So he believed that slavery not only limited the freedom of the enslaved, but also of the enslaver. So that basically slavery is bad for everybody involved. So radical abolitionism grows gradually in the United States until it becomes a major force in Northern culture. And this eventually helps to spawn a major anti-slavery political party, the Republican Party, which Abraham Lincoln belonged to. But so in spite of the growing significance of abolitionism in Northern culture, a lot of people in the North continued to oppose abolition up until the very end of the Civil War. For a long time, abolitionism remained really kind of a small movement in the North. And this was mostly because Americans were more worried about other stuff. They were worried about the economy, they were worried about immigration, and they were worried about westward expansion. Also, some Northerners were just racist and didn't care about the state of black men and women in the South. This also helps to explain a large part of a Northern apathy to Southern slavery. Some Northern groups continued to oppose abolition violently until the very end. There was, first of all, the Northern textile factory owners. Many of these guys who owned this factory that depended on cotton from the South opposed abolition because they were worried that this threat to slavery would threaten the production of cotton and therefore threaten their factories. So they continued to support slavery because that was how they got the cotton that they needed to make their money. Also, Northern immigrants, especially Irish immigrants who worked low-paid jobs, were afraid that if African Americans were freed, then they would begin to compete for these low-paying jobs, and that the Irish might be forced out of work. So these groups continued to oppose abolitionism until the very end, but in the end it doesn't matter because the abolitionists win and slavery is ended with the end of the Civil War. Your goals? Hopefully you can now answer all of these questions, and we will talk about these more next time we have class.